Hello everyone, welcome everyone to the channel's Strange Night Podcast. Story 1, The Watcher. In 2014, in the quiet town of Westfield, New Jersey, a place known as a sanctuary for the upper middle class, lined with ancient oak trees and magnificent Victorian homes, the Broaddus family believed they had finally touched the American dream. Derek and Maria Broaddus, a young couple with 3 small children, spent $1.35 million to own the majestic mansion at 657 Boulevard. It was a 6-bedroom house, a testament to their success and future happiness. But they didn't know that behind the perfect facade of those cedar-shingled walls, a pair of eyes had been waiting for them for a long time. Just 3 days after receiving the keys, while Derek was painting a few walls on the first floor, he went out to the mailbox and found a thick white envelope addressed to the new owner. Inside was a handwritten letter with words that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. The writer did not sign a name. He called himself the Watcher. In a prose that was both archaic and menacing, he wrote, 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now. As it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. Initially, Derek thought it was a cruel prank from unfriendly neighbors. But as he read the next passage, his skepticism turned into sheer terror. The stranger knew details about his family that were impossibly intimate. He mentioned their 3 children, referring to them as young blood, and asked if their parents were afraid to let them play in the basement. He wrote, I see that you have flooded the house with young blood. Was that a mistake? Congratulations on your move-in. Do you need to fill the house with the screams of the children? I will watch and wait for the day the young blood will play again. From that moment on, the dream home became a fortress of anxiety. Derek and Maria immediately contacted the police, but they were met with a dead end. The Westfield police were stunned. In the town's long history, they had never encountered anything so bizarre. They tested the DNA on the envelope and found it belonged to a woman, but it didn't match anyone in the national database. Subsequent letters continued to arrive, becoming increasingly detailed and aggressive. The Watcher seemed to be everywhere. He knew about the contractors they hired. He knew the nicknames they had for their children, and he began to criticize the renovations they were making. He wrote, I see the contractors working. You are ruining the house. You are making it sad. Do not make it angry. The Broaddus family began to look at every neighbor with suspicion. Was it the elderly man next door who sat staring blankly toward their porch? Or was it the Langford family, who lived right next door and seemed eccentric and reclusive? Paranoia began to eat away at Derek and Maria's sanity. They installed a massive security camera system, hired private investigators, and even brought in former FBI agents, but the result was always a haunting 0. The Watcher was like a ghost. He knew the blind spots of every camera, and he knew exactly when the family was present and when they were not. The horror reached its peak when one letter stated, the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the Watcher, and have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. It is your turn. You will never see me, but I am always there." Terrified for the safety of their children, the Broaddus family never actually moved into the house. They spent millions on a place they were afraid to sleep in for even a single night. They tried to sell the property, but rumors of the Watcher had spread across the nation, making potential buyers stay far away. The house became a scar in the middle of a beautiful town, a symbol of isolation and malice hidden under a veil of peace. Years passed, and the case remains unsolved. Some say the Broaddus family orchestrated it themselves for an insurance scam, but the evidence of their mental breakdown suggests otherwise. In 2019, they finally sold the house at a massive loss of over $400,000. The new owners moved in, and strangely, the letters stopped. But to this day, when you drive down Boulevard in Westfield, you will see house number 657 standing there, silent and imposing. People still whisper that perhaps the Watcher never left. He could be the mailman, the neighbor mowing the lawn, or simply a shadow still lurking behind the curtains, smiling and waiting for the next young blood to step into his domain. The story of the Watcher is a chilling reminder. Sometimes the place where you feel safest is exactly where you are being watched most closely. And the greatest secret of 657 Boulevard remains trapped in letters that never found a sender, rotting with time, but leaving a fear that will last forever. Story 2. The Screams at Villisca Farm. In 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa was the definition of tranquility. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's name, where cornfields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and where doors were never locked. But on the morning of June 10th of that year, Villisca's innocence was brutally executed in one of the most horrifying crimes ever recorded in American criminal history. The Moore family, consisting of the father Josiah, the mother Sarah, and their 4 young children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were a model family, wealthy and deeply respected. That evening, they returned home from a church service accompanied by 2 young friends of the children, the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, who had received permission from their parents to stay the night. 8 people walked into the house at 508 East 2nd Street, completely unaware that death had been waiting for them for a long time. In the thick darkness of the attic, a stranger had been hiding patiently for hours. He listened to the children's laughter, the heavy footsteps of Josiah and Sarah as they prepared for bed. He waited until the steady rhythm of snoring filled the house, until the entire home was submerged in its deepest sleep. It was then that he stepped out of the shadows, clutching Josiah's own axe, which he had found in the backyard. The killer began in the master bedroom. The devastating blows from the blunt end of the axe meant the parents never had a chance to make a sound. Then he moved through the children's rooms. A total of 8 lives were savagely taken while they were still in the middle of their dreams. Only young Lena Stillinger showed signs of resistance, a defensive wound on her arm and a body position suggesting she had awakened for one terrifying second before the blade fell. But what made this case truly bone-chilling, haunting investigators for over a century, was not just the blood and death, but the bizarre details the killer left behind. After the slaughter, the murderer didn't flee immediately. Instead, he calmly performed a grotesque ritual. He took cloth from the house and covered every single mirror and every window pane. He took a slab of raw bacon from the icebox, weighing about 2 pounds, and placed it on the kitchen table next to the blood-stained axe. He even searched through drawers to find fabric to cover the faces of the victims after he had killed them. The police discovered the scene the following morning when neighbors noticed the eerie silence coming from the Moore residence. There were no signs of robbery. There was no clear motive. A string of suspects was brought into focus, from a mentally unstable minister named Reverend Kelly, who had left town early that morning, to a serial killer who supposedly traveled along the railway lines. However, despite years of investigation and 2 sensational trials, no one was ever convicted. Justice was never served for the Moore family. Today, the house in Villisca still stands, but it is no longer a home. It is known as the Villisca Axe Murder House. Those brave enough to rent the house for an overnight stay often tell stories that send them running into the night. They hear heavy footsteps in the attic, the faint, muffled sobbing of children coming from empty rooms. There are reports of objects moving on their own, and tall, dark shadows standing at the foot of the bed, holding something long and heavy. Paranormal investigators who visit the site claim that the spirits of the 6 children are still trapped there, forever fleeing their killer in an endless loop of darkness. Some have even captured chilling EVP recordings, where a child's voice whispers, "He's in the closet." The story of the Villisca farm is a heartbreaking testament to how evil can penetrate even the most peaceful places. It leaves a question that remains unanswered after more than 100 years. Who was hiding in the attic that night? And why did he cover the mirrors? Perhaps even a monster didn't have the courage to look into his own eyes in a mirror after committing such an ultimate atrocity. The house remains silent in the middle of that Iowa town, keeping its secrets locked within its rotting wood, waiting for anyone daring enough to step through the door and face the screams that have been silenced since 1912. Story 3. The Curse of Lake Lanier. If you look at the promotional photos of Lake Lanier in Georgia, you will see a sapphire paradise filled with luxury yachts and shimmering resorts. But do not let that beauty deceive you. Local residents have a saying: at Lanier, you never swim alone. Because beneath that still, silent water lies a wiped-out town, forgotten graves, and hundreds of souls desperate for someone to take their place. The story of Lake Lanier doesn't begin with an ancient hex, but with a human betrayal. In the 1950s, the U.S. government decided to build a dam to provide electricity and water to the city of Atlanta. To accomplish this, they had to flood over 15,000 acres of land, including a bustling community known as Oscarville. Oscarville was more than just a piece of land. It was a place of painful memories. In 1912, a brutal racial cleansing drove thousands of black residents from their homes in the dead of night. When the government flooded the area to create Lake Lanier, they didn't have the patience to move everything. Houses, churches, and, most horrifyingly, at least 20 cemeteries with thousands of graves were permanently submerged under the deep, dark water. Since the lake was formed, a chain of bizarre and deadly events began to unfold. According to official statistics, over 700 people have perished here. There are drownings that even the strongest swimmers cannot explain. Survivors tell an identical, bone-chilling story. While swimming in deep areas, they suddenly felt cold, skeletal hands grip their ankles, pulling them violently toward the bottom. It wasn't the sensation of being tangled in weeds or branches. It was a pull with intent, a conscious effort to drown. The most famous of the ghosts here is the Lady of the Lake. In 1958, a car carrying two women, Delia Mae Parker Young and Susie Roberts, lost control and plunged off a bridge into the water. A year later, the body of a woman was found floating on the surface. She was wearing a blue dress, but what terrified everyone was that her hands were missing. To this day, many witnesses claim to have seen the figure of a woman in a long dress gliding across the surface of the lake on foggy nights. She has no hands, and her face is a hollow, dark void. They say she is still wandering, searching for her lost hands, or perhaps looking for someone to drag down into the silt to keep her company. At the bottom of Lake Lanier, visibility is near zero due to the silt and decaying vegetation. Rescue divers describe the lake floor as a nightmare labyrinth. They find massive, dead trees reaching up like monster claws, and houses that are still structurally intact, forming deadly underwater traps. One diver once recounted seeing a dark shadow sitting on the porch of a submerged house, staring back at him through his oxygen mask. But the most frightening thing is not the ghosts. It is the silence. Lake Lanier seems to possess a strange magnetic pull, driving people toward reckless behavior. There are unexplained boat explosions, people who vanish without a trace, and screams for help that echo across the water at midnight when no one is there. Some believe the spirits at the bottom of the lake are angry. They are furious because their homes were stolen, their graves were desecrated, and their bodies have been soaked in cold darkness for over half a century. Every year, Lake Lanier demands more lives, like a blood tax that the living must pay for what was buried beneath. If you ever find yourself standing on the shores of Lake Lanier, be careful when the sun goes down. When the waves lap gently against the side of your boat, it might not be the wind. It might be the whispers of those in the depths, waiting for you to slip for just a second, so they can bring you home to the eternal town of Oscarville. Story 4. The Entry at Sally House. The town of Atchison, Kansas is famous as the birthplace of the legendary aviator Amelia Earhart. But in the world of ghost hunting, Atchison is known for a far more terrifying landmark, the Sally House at 508 North 2nd Street. This is not just a typical haunted house. It is a battlefield for a dark entity that harbors a deep, violent hatred for men. The nightmare began in the early 1990s when Tony and Deborah Pickman moved in, preparing to welcome their first child. They were a young couple full of hope, but their joy was short-lived. From the very first days, Tony felt something was wrong. He constantly felt watched by an invisible gaze from the dark corners of the staircase or the silence of the kitchen. Initially, the manifestations were subtle. Toys moved on their own. The faint giggling of a little girl echoed through the night, and wall pictures were frequently found hanging upside down. The Pickmans believed they were living with the spirit of a child. According to local legend, in the 19th century, a young girl named Sally died in agony in this house during a botched appendectomy. Feeling sympathy for the small soul, Tony and Deborah tried to coexist peacefully. But their compassion was a fatal mistake. This entity was not Sally, and it was far from innocent. The violence began to target Tony directly. He was frequently subjected to unprovoked physical attacks. There were nights when he would wake up with a searing, flesh-tearing pain on his back. When Deborah turned on the lights, she was horrified to see long, red, bleeding scratches appearing on her husband's skin. as if an invisible hand with razor-sharp claws had just raked across him. These scratches didn't just appear on his back. They appeared on his chest and arms, often forming bizarre patterns or cryptic symbols. More terrifyingly, the entity seemed capable of manipulating the physical world. Small fires would spontaneously erupt on carpets or inside closets with no heat source. The air in the house frequently grew thick with the smell of sulfur, a scent that exorcists confirm is a hallmark of the demonic. Furniture was hurled across rooms, aimed directly at Tony's head. Every time he tried to protect his family, the entity became more frenzied. The peak of their terror came when they realized the entity could shapeshift. Deborah recounted seeing a small figure resembling a girl in a white dress standing in the corner of a room. But as she approached, the child's face suddenly distorted into a withered, ancient visage with pitch-black eyes full of malice. It wasn't a trapped soul. It was an ancient entity, borrowing Sally's name and form to gain permission to remain in the house and feed on human fear. The Pickman family finally fled the house after 2 years of torment. They could not risk their young child's life for another second. However, even after they left, Sally refused to let go. Tony reported that for years afterward, he would still occasionally find mysterious scratches on his body during the nights of a waning moon, a chilling reminder that he once belonged to the shadows of Atchison. Later paranormal investigations discovered a gruesome truth in the house's basement. It is a narrow, dark area where the air is always several degrees colder than the rest of the house. Sensitive individuals who step down there feel a crushing pressure on their chests, accompanied by low, guttural growls emanating from the cracks in the stone walls. It is believed to be the entity's lair, where it lurks to watch and wait for its next victim. The Sally House still stands today, drawing thousands of curious visitors and psychics from around the world. Many have fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind audio tapes filled with screams and unexplained bruises. The story of the Sally House is a grim lesson in the deception of evil. Never trust what appears to be the most vulnerable, for behind the mask of a child may hide the face of the devil itself, smiling. If you ever find yourself passing North 2nd Street in Atchison in the late afternoon, beware of the small shadow by the second-floor window. It might be waving at you, but whatever you do, never wave back. Because once you catch its eye, Sally's game truly begins. Story 6. The Bridgewater Triangle. In southeastern Massachusetts, there exists a region of about 200 square miles, encompassing the towns of Abington, Freetown, and Rehoboth. It is known as the Bridgewater Triangle, a stretch of land where every law of nature and logic seems to bend and break. If the Bermuda Triangle is a place that swallows ships, then the Bridgewater Triangle is a place that swallows the sanity of anyone brave enough to enter its core. The Hockomock Swamp. In the native Wampanoag language, Hockomock means the place where spirits dwell. They warned white settlers hundreds of years ago that this was cursed ground, a place where the darkness itself possesses life. But the true terror only began to explode in the 1970s, continuing to this day with a series of inexplicable reports. Imagine you are driving down a lonely back road at dawn, and suddenly a massive creature with a wingspan of over 10 feet glides over the roof of your car. This is the Thunderbird, the legendary bird of prey that many residents here swear they have witnessed. But that is only the beginning. The Bridgewater Triangle is also said to be home to creatures that folklore calls puckwudgies, small, human-like entities with distorted faces that lure people deep into the woods, only to push them off cliffs or lead them to their deaths. The horror of this land also stems from violent spiritual phenomena. In the Freetown Fall River State Forest, countless traces of occult rituals have been found. Stone circles, meticulously sacrificed animal remains, and even murders linked to devil worship occurred here in the 1980s. Hikers report that even in broad daylight, the silence here is terrifying. There are no birds singing, no insects buzzing, only a heavy, suffocating sensation, as if the air is trying to crush your lungs. One of the most haunted spots in the Triangle is Profile Rock. Native people believe this is where the spirits of fallen warriors still guard their territory. Many visitors report seeing ghostly figures sitting atop the rock, silently watching them. When they try to approach, the figures vanish into thin air, leaving behind a pungent smell like burnt flesh. Beyond strange creatures and spirits, the Bridgewater Triangle is a hot spot for mysterious lights. Orbs of fire hover over the swamp, and streaks of blue light slash across the night sky without making a single sound. Local police have received hundreds of calls over the decades, but every time they arrive, all that remains is the eerie silence of the Hockomock. There is a famous account from a police officer in 1971. While on night patrol, he saw a creature that looked like a bear, but walked on two legs, standing over 7 feet tall, with eyes glowing red like hot coals. It stared directly at him before vanishing into the thick brush with terrifying speed. His gun was drawn, but a primal fear kept him from pulling the trigger. Why does one small area in Massachusetts converge all these horrors? From UFOs and cryptids to ghosts and cults. Some researchers believe a rift between dimensions exists here. Others believe the past atrocities committed against the indigenous people left a spiritual wound that never healed, turning the land into a magnet for negative entities. If you ever intend to explore the Bridgewater Triangle, remember one thing: never stray from the main path after the sun has set. The Hockomock Swamp is not just mud and stagnant water. It is a hungry entity. And in the shadows of the ancient oak trees, there are things waiting for you. Things that were there before history was written, and they have no intention of letting you leave easily. Story 7. The Mystery of the Sodder Children. Christmas Eve, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, should have been a night of miracles and family reunions. George and Jenny Sodder, along with 9 of their children, had just finished a warm holiday dinner. But as the clock struck midnight, a series of bizarre events began to unfold, marking the beginning of a nightmare that would last for over half a century. It started with a phone call at 12:30 a.m. Jenny picked up the receiver, but on the other end, there was only the high-pitched laughter of a woman and the clinking of glasses in a noisy room. She hung up, noticing that the lights in the house were still on and the curtains hadn't been drawn, tasks the children were supposed to have finished. She saw her youngest daughter asleep on the sofa and quietly went back to bed. But just as she closed her eyes, a loud thud hit the roof, sounding like a heavy object falling and rolling away. Half an hour later, thick smoke filled the bedroom. The house was on fire. George and Jenny managed to escape with 4 of their children, but the other 5, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still trapped on the 2nd floor. George frantically tried to run back in to save them, but the staircase was blocked by a wall of fire. He ran outside to grab the tall ladder usually leaning against the side of the house, but it had mysteriously vanished. He tried to start his 2 trucks to drive them closer to the second-floor window to climb up, but both vehicles, which had been working perfectly, suddenly and simultaneously failed to start. Even the water barrels they kept for emergencies were found strangely frozen solid. They could do nothing but stand by and watch their home burn to the ground in just 45 minutes. But the true nightmare only began when the sun came up. After the fire died out, firefighters and police searched the ashes. The results were staggering. Not a single fragment of bone was found. Experts later stated that a typical house fire does not burn hot enough or long enough to completely cremate human bones into nothingness. The 5 Sodder children had seemingly vanished into thin air just before the flames erupted. The Sodder family refused to believe their children were dead. They began to piece together strange occurrences from the months prior. A stranger had appeared at their home, pointing at the fuse box and warning that it would cause a fire, even though an electrician had recently certified it as safe. Another man, while trying to sell George life insurance, lost his temper and cursed him. "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed," simply because George had criticized the dictator Mussolini. George was an Italian immigrant. In the years that followed, chilling clues continued to surface. A witness reported seeing the 5 children in a car without estate plates on the night of the fire. A waitress at a restaurant 50 miles away swore she served breakfast to the children the following morning. The mystery reached a fever pitch in 1967, 22 years after the fire. Jenny received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man who looked exactly like Louis, her missing son, with a handwritten note on the back. "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Little boys. A90132. The family hired a private investigator to find the origin of the photo, but the investigator vanished without a trace shortly after he set out. The Sodders spent the rest of their lives maintaining a massive billboard along the highway featuring photos of their 5 children and offering a reward for any information. They died never knowing the truth. To this day, the Sodder mystery remains an open wound in American history. Were the children kidnapped by politically motivated extortionists? Were they taken back to Italy to start a new life? Or did something much darker slip into the house that night, taking the children before setting the fire to erase all evidence? The answer likely burned away with the wooden house that night, leaving only the photograph of a young man with sorrowful eyes, a haunting reminder of a Christmas Eve where a miracle was traded for a curse. Story 8. The Whispers of the Bell Witch. In 1817, in the rugged countryside of Adams, Tennessee, John Bell, a respected and wealthy farmer, was walking through his cornfield when he encountered a bizarre creature. It had the body of a dog, but the head of a rabbit. When John raised his gun and fired, the creature vanished into thin air. He had no way of knowing that that single gunshot was an invitation for a malevolent entity to enter his family's life, an entity the world would later come to know as the Bell Witch. Initially, the phenomena followed a familiar poltergeist pattern: heavy pounding on the doors in the middle of the night, scratching sounds against the wooden walls, and the sound of chains dragging across the floorboards. But things quickly escalated into true psychological and physical warfare. The Bell children were pulled by their hair and slapped across their faces by invisible hands while they slept. Curiously, the entity seemed to harbor a deep-seated hatred for John Bell. and a strange, suffocating obsession with his youngest daughter, Betsy. What set the Bell Witch completely apart from other hauntings was its ability to communicate. The entity began as a whisper, then graduated to speaking clearly in multiple distinct voices. It could quote scripture, sing hymns, and debate theology with sophisticated intellect. When asked who it was, it identified itself as Kate Batts, a former neighbor who believed John Bell had cheated her in a land deal and had sworn to curse him to his grave. The terror spread so far that even Andrew Jackson, who would later become the 7th President of the United States, decided to investigate. But as his carriage reached the boundary of the Bell property, the horses suddenly stopped dead, as if hitting an invisible wall. After witnessing the entity's power firsthand, Jackson famously remarked, "I would rather fight the entire British Army than face the Bell Witch." The torture of John Bell became increasingly cruel. He suffered from facial seizures and a swollen tongue that made it impossible for him to eat or speak. The entity would frequently scream vile curses into his face. "You are a sinner, John Bell, and I will not stop until you are dead." On December 20th, 1820, John Bell was found in a deep coma. Beside his bed was a strange, dark vial of liquid. When the family gave a single drop to the house cat, the animal died instantly. At that moment, a triumphant voice echoed through the empty room. "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, and it fixed him." John Bell died shortly after. At his funeral, the entity refused to show mercy, loudly singing cheerful songs to mock the family's grief. After John's death, the entity gradually withdrew, but it left behind a chilling promise that it would return after 107 years. In 1935, exactly 107 years later, the descendants of the Bell family and local residents reported hearing whispers again in the limestone caves near the old farm, a place now known as the Bell Witch Cave. Today, the cave remains open to visitors, but the sensation of coldness and hostility in the air is something everyone feels. Electronic devices frequently malfunction, and many capture misty apparitions lingering near the cave entrance. The Bell Witch is not just a piece of folklore. It was an entity with intelligence, malice, and the power to alter human destiny. The story leaves a spine-tingling warning. There are debts that cannot be paid with money, and there are spirits that will haunt you through generations, turning your life into a stage for their demonic games. Even now, in the quiet darkness of Adams, Tennessee, people still whisper, "If you hear your name called in the wind, never answer." Because it might be Kate, and she is still waiting for a new victim to fulfill her curse. Story 9. The Bloody Pit. Deep beneath the Hoosac Mountains in Massachusetts lies a railroad tunnel nearly 5 miles long. When it was completed in 1875, it was hailed as an engineering marvel. But that marvel came at a staggering cost. 193 lives were buried within the heart of the mountain. Workers of the time called it by a terrifying name, the Bloody Pit. And they believed the souls of those who perished never left that cold, eternal darkness. The most horrific nightmare occurred on October 17, 1867. A massive gas explosion destroyed the pumping station and the hoist of the tunnel's central shaft. 13 miners working 500 feet underground were trapped as flaming debris and tons of heavy equipment fell, sealing the only exit. Those on the surface believed no one could have survived the explosion and the subsequent fire. They abandoned the rescue efforts. But the truth was far more gruesome. Months later, when divers finally reached the bottom of the shaft, they discovered a haunting scene. The workers had not died instantly. They had survived the blast, constructed a makeshift raft to float on the rising waters in the pitch-black darkness, and slowly succumbed to asphyxiation and despair. It is said that on quiet nights, the rhythmic sound of hammers striking the stone, a desperate plea for help, still echoes from deep within the mountain, a chilling reminder of their cruel abandonment. Since then, the Hoosac Tunnel has become a magnet for the inexplicable. In 1872, a foreman named Ned Brinkman and two other workers were inspecting the tunnel when a premature explosion occurred. Ned was buried under tons of rock. His two colleagues vanished without a trace. A week later, Ned's body was recovered. But strangely, he was found in a completely different location. And witnesses swore they saw a ghost resembling Ned carrying a lantern through the tunnel just moments before the body was found. For over a century, railroad engineers and maintenance crews have whispered unwritten rules for entering Hoosac. Never look back if you hear footsteps behind you, and always carry a spare light. There are reports of trains suddenly emergency braking because the engineers saw a group of spectral figures standing directly on the tracks, only for the figures to vanish the moment the train ground to a halt. The air inside the tunnel is always at least 10 degrees colder than outside, and occasionally it grows thick with the smell of gunpowder and burnt flesh, even when no work is being done. In the 1970s, a photographer named Joe Impoko entered the tunnel to capture images of the historic architecture. While standing alone in the darkness, he heard the sound of hymns echoing from the stone walls. The singing was melodic, yet profoundly mournful, as if dozens of voices were harmonizing together. When Joe raised his camera, he saw through the lens translucent figures kneeling in prayer along the rails. When he lowered the camera, they were gone, leaving only the deafening silence of the mountain. They say the Hoosac Mountain is like a living entity. It swallowed those poor men, and now it grips their souls tight to keep it company in eternal solitude. The fallen miners are not just ghosts. They are the guardians of the tunnel. They appear to warn of impending collapses, or sometimes to lure the curious deep into the darkness so they never find their way out. Today, trains still roar through the Hoosac Tunnel, their headlights slicing through the dark for a few fleeting minutes. But if you are a passenger on one of those trains, try looking out the window as you pass the central shaft. You might see small flickering lights that aren't electric, but the oil lanterns of ghost miners, still tirelessly digging in their massive stone grave, waiting for a day to see the sunlight they lost over 100 years ago. Story 10. The Devil's Tavern. In the town of Wilder, Kentucky, there sits a nightclub called Bobby Mackey's Music World. To fans of country music, it's a lively honky-tonk destination. But to paranormal investigators, it is the single most terrifying location in America. A sign at the entrance carries a chilling disclaimer. Warning: we are not responsible for any supernatural events that may occur to our patrons. This is not a marketing gimmick. It is a necessary warning. The nightclub was built on the site of a 19th century slaughterhouse. Deep in the basement lies a dry well that was once used to drain the blood and offal of slaughtered animals into the Licking River. But animal blood wasn't the only thing that flowed down that drain. In 1896, a murder shocked the nation. A young woman named Pearl Bryan was found brutally murdered. Her head had been surgically removed. The killers were Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling, men rumored to be members of an occult society. Legend has it that they brought Pearl's head to the basement of this very slaughterhouse to perform a sacrificial ritual, tossing the head down the well to open a portal to hell. Before he stepped onto the gallows, Alonzo Walling swore that his spirit would return to haunt the site forever, and he kept his word. When Bobby Mackey bought the building in the 1970s to open his tavern, the nightmare was reborn. His wife, Janet, who was pregnant at the time, was pushed down the basement stairs by an invisible force while a voice hissed, "Get out!" Bobby, a staunch skeptic, was forced to face the truth as evidence mounted before his eyes. Liquor bottles flew off shelves, the jukebox played while unplugged, and patrons frequently reported being slapped, scratched, or shoved by tall, dark shadows. The epicenter of the horror is the well area in the basement, famously dubbed the portal to hell. Ghost hunters often record bone-chilling sounds emanating from the mouth of the well. Animalistic growls, agonizing screams, and whispers in unknown languages. An entity known as the Black Man is frequently sighted here. He has glowing red eyes and radiates a hatred so intense that even the toughest investigators have collapsed from nausea and dizziness in his presence. Carl Lawson, a former caretaker who lived upstairs, was the most severely tormented victim. He claimed to have been possessed by multiple spirits dwelling within the walls. Exorcisms were conducted right inside the tavern, and audio recordings from those sessions revealed guttural, demonic voices coming from Carl's mouth, mocking the priests and declaring that the building belonged to them. Why is evil so deeply rooted at Bobby Mackey's? Some psychics believe that the combination of the slaughterhouse's residual energy, the murder of Pearl Bryan, and subsequent occult rituals created an indelible black spot in the spiritual world. It is like an open wound on the earth, constantly attracting lost souls and dark entities from the other side. To this day, Bobby Mackey continues his business, despite reports of paranormal activity occurring almost every night. Many tourists come seeking a thrill, but they often leave with unexplained bruises on their skin and a fear that haunts them for a lifetime. The story of the Devil's Tavern concludes our series with a final message. There are doors that, once opened, can never be closed. Evil does not fade with time. It merely hides beneath the floorboards, in the dark corners of the wine cellar, waiting for a melody to play so it can begin its dance of death once more. If you ever find yourself in Kentucky and step into Bobby Mackey's, remember, never go into the basement alone. Because down there, where the light never reaches, the entities from the ancient well are still waiting to whisper a secret from hell into your ear. Thank you for listening to this series. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear the next series.